On October 3rd, 1995, the O.J. Simpson verdict was read. Like many of you, I can tell you exactly where I was when it happened. I think I've even talked about it on the podcast. My high school library, where TVs had been rolled in on carts so we students could watch. A year and a half later, on March 26, 1997, 39 people died by suicide in a mansion outside of San Diego. I had just turned 18, was close to graduating high school, and while this event shook the nation, the headline would never make its way to me until many years later. So I wondered, as I often do, why? I asked others what they remember, and they say bits and pieces, but most people I know don't have a strong recollection of the moment when they heard this story. And what a story it is. It was a coordinated series of ritual suicides in order to reach what they believed would be an extraterrestrial spacecraft following the comet Hale-Bopp. Investigators believe the suicides happened over the course of 3 days. Group members wore matching black outfits and black and white Nikes, which would become a notorious icon of the cult's story, and eerie, heartbreaking video messages from the cult members were left to be discovered. But this tragedy did not happen overnight or over the course of 3 days. The seeds were planted back in the early 1970s when Marshall Applewhite, known to the group as Doe, met Bonnie Nettles, who members called T, though it seems, and there are accounts, that they also were referred to as Bo and Peep. Marshall and Bonnie drew curious folks into their circle by appealing to their quest to understand other universes and other realms. Marshall's own upbringing was religious, and he seemed to infuse aliens and UFO fantasy with Christian theology and even claimed to be the resurrected Christ. But what they were mostly after wasn't to be found in practices on Earth, but through ascension to heaven, which would come via a UFO when the time was right. At first, the leaders told the group it would just be a matter of months. But soon it was a year, then 10, then another decade. In the meantime, members of what the group called the class lived a nomadic life together, sharing all resources among the group and all non-working hours being taught by White and Nettles in the classroom. Bonnie Nettles died of liver cancer in 1985, and this event seemed to have impacted Marshall significantly. He said she would continue to help them prepare for the next level, and the group did so for years, eventually becoming early adopters of the internet and earning a living by designing web pages, including their own, which still exists to this day. My guest today is Frank Lyford. Frank spent nearly 18 years of his life in the Heaven's Gate cult and has done the hard work of recovery to make sense of and heal from his experience there. Frank is now a life coach, and as you will hear, he is incredibly spiritual, wise, and I would say has a very unique perspective on what happened to him and what happened after. As we move along in this series on cults, Frank's story is so important because he isn't an expert on anything except his own experience. A lot of what he said challenged my preconceived notions on the perpetrators of wrongdoings in cults, as well as the terms victim and survivor and what those even mean. I am so grateful for Frank's vulnerability and willingness to go deep during our conversation. And I don't usually say this, but I would encourage you to listen to today's episode with an open mind and an open heart. And now, here is my conversation with Frank Lyford. Frank, thank you so much for being on Dialogue, a true crime conversation. I'm really excited to talk with you this evening.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. Thank you for being willing to share your story. As I told you a little bit offline, my listeners have been on a journey with me learning about cults from some of the leading experts in the country, but I'm really excited to hear from people like me and my listeners about their real life story of getting involved and then getting out. And I know your recovery has been really vital and transformative, and I want you to tell us all about it. But maybe we'll start just a little before now, which is, back in, let's say, the early 1970s. Of course, we're talking about the Heaven's Gate cult. And from the research I did, it seems that you were quite drawn to it and that it spoke to you, it resonated because you were already thinking in these ways, that there's maybe another world out there and there must be more than just what we see and hear and feel and know on this earth. So could you talk about kind of what you were like at that age and how that made you possibly more susceptible to a group's teaching on that?
Well, okay. There were a lot of factors, in retrospect anyway, that went into my susceptibility to being interested in what later was called the cults. I don't know where to start with this. My parents were they were just starting to be interested in metaphysical things. I wasn't brought up in a religious household. My parents were Unitarian, which is kind of a humanistic approach to the whole question of religion. But I remember my mother introducing me to an Edgar Cayce biography called There Is a River, about Edgar Cayce, and he was one of the first trance channelers of information other than, what was commonly known, or how information was commonly arrived at through deduction and research and logic. This fellow would just go to sleep and into a trance state, and people would ask him questions, and he would come up with the answers. And there was a whole organization formed around his Q&A, around the answers that he gave. And so I was fascinated by that book. I was also fascinated by UFOs. I was intrigued by UFOs. I read several UFO books in my teens, and then there was the kind of the intuitive factor that raised its head during my upbringing. I would look out. I remember looking out across the landscape during drives on vacation to see grandparents or cousins or go camping, and feeling like the landscape seemed so dull and drab, and life didn't seem as bright and colorful as it felt like it should. And my perspective on those flashes, was that I was remembering either past lives in which I lived in a place where there was more interesting and more vibrant life circumstances than I experienced as a child. And it's not like I had an unhappy childhood. I didn't. It was a good childhood. So there was always this question in the back of my mind of, isn't there something more than what is presented in everyday view of reality? And so I suppose the openness of my parents to metaphysical things, they became more and more interested in doing their own searching in that way. And I was kind of the same mind, although, I was a normal kid, a normal teenager. I don't know if that speaks to the question thoroughly enough.
I think it does. I think it does. And what's making sense to me, as somebody who never really considered UFOs to be a viable possibility or thought about that, I do know that I'm somebody who wonders and thinks and believes there should be something more, there must be something more. And what I uncovered in my conversation last week with Dr. Lalich is, one cult does not fit all, right? Like there's a message within every group that's going to be better targeted to a specific person. So while I wouldn't have probably maybe taken the flyer and gone to the first meeting for Heaven's Gate, I think I might have signed up for a class for NXIVM when it was called Executive Success Program for Self-Improvement, right? So I think that's just an important distinction, because I think it's easy for people to say, well, not me, wouldn't happen to me. But I just think there's so many varieties of cults that do appeal and cater to a specific type of person. So it's helpful to hear how you were thinking in your youth and in your adolescence that maybe primed you to be more open at that juncture when you did encounter them.
Right. And as you were talking, another thought I had was the nature of the thought system that they presented in the first meeting, and my exposure to them over the first year or so was to present a way of thinking and being that answered so many of my own questions, but they were also presenting a ready-made thought system that, in a sense, took away the responsibility for me to think for myself. And the reason that I was susceptible to that was, like so many of us in childhood, we are not allowed to express our authenticity, or if we do, we're punished for it because it for whatever reason it feels inappropriate to our parents or our teachers or whoever is managing us as children. So that curtailment of my ability to feel free to be me was an ingrained pattern. And so, as we'll probably talk about more later, I feel like it's really important for us to be in touch with our own inner guidance system. And if I had to cut to the chase and say, what one thing did I learn from my experience in the Heaven's Gate cult? It was to pay attention to my intuition, pay attention to what my inner guidance is telling me, whether you see that as your connection with Holy Spirit or your connection with higher self, or you could call it your gut knowing, but whatever it is, that's our guiding light. So I feel like that was a commonality with everyone who became a member of the Heaven's Gate cult, is they didn't feel safe to choose their own inner guidance system. And because of that, they weren't probably in touch with it. Whereas someone else who came across the same meeting within the first 5 minutes of it probably said, these people are crazy, and they would have left. So, but there are so many factors that come into any decision that any of us makes, and most of them are subconscious and unconscious.
So, can I ask, and this is getting ahead, but I think since you brought that up, that's really interesting to me. When you finally left, and we'll get to what your journey was like, because you ended up spending, was it 20 years within the cult?
Almost. It was
Almost.
18 years.
years. So, how hard was it for you to identify your intuition and to trust it after all those years of repressing it and not knowing its signs and its cues for yourself? What was that like?
Well, the reason that I left was not through any inner conscious choice that I made. I had to speak with several people years after I left to really understand that inner dynamic that caused me to leave. One of those was the Anya Lalich. Among others, this was at a Cult Awareness Network seminar. So really what happened that caused me to even consider leaving, it's not black and white. You mentioned that intuition was repressed, and that was absolutely correct. It was repressed. I was indoctrinated, and you might say brainwashed, by the teachings of T and Do, Bo and Peep, the two leaders of the cult. But it was out of a desire to follow the rules of the club that they had created, with the goal of meeting the requirements for ascension. We believed we would ascend. So everyone who was there, who was part of that group, had the same goal. We wanted to meet the requirements that supposedly T and Do had been given by their older members, the people above them that they were listening to. These were people not in their presence, but people who were communicating with them telepathically. And so there was continually all of this indoctrination, you could say, but it was instruction after procedure, after guidelines, after how to live, how to think, how to speak, how to eat, how to sleep, how to work with others, how to live your life in a way that was conducive to surviving and thriving as a member of this next evolutionary level above human. So we haven't gotten into the thought system at all, but that's kind of the motivation, our daily motivation in a nutshell. So that was my focus. And if there were ever any red flags that came up, I wasn't, it, it was out of place to express any misgiving I might have had about that. If Tiendo said something and it seemed wrong, I immediately overruled that thought because Tiendo were our teachers, and we definitely did put them on pedestals. We're way ahead of ourselves probably, but T, the woman, passed on, I believe it was 1985, from liver cancer, and that wasn't ever part of the plan. And the way that Joe presented it was that she had gone on ahead to prepare a place for us for when we were ready to ascend as well. And of course, we'd already been together as a group, nomadic, uh, in a classroom experience for years, moving to going on decades, because that's just how it happened. Even though Tiendo said it was never supposed to take years, they expected early on, they expected it to take months. But when it came up that it was taking longer than expected, the reason was always, well, you as the students are not moving fast enough. We never expected it to take that long.
Wow.
So it was in effect an indirect guilt trip, but that did serve to help us to buckle down, focus more, even though it took decades.
So, can I ask organizationally how it functioned that you were able to move around? Were the members earning income and bringing it right back to the group at large and to the class and the teachers? Is that why would you move for different employment opportunities, or was it all very isolated? How did you make it all work, I guess?
Well, the group called itself the class because it was a classroom in preparation for the next level, for graduating into the next evolutionary level above human. Um, so we went through stages. Initially, for the first year, there wasn't a lot of structure, and we traveled in groups of 8 or 10 or 12, giving meetings. That was what would be called a recruitment phase. And then at the end of that year, Tiendo called us together into a campground in Wyoming, and that was the formal start of the classroom experience. So for the first, that was 1976, late 76. And then early 80s, we moved into houses from campgrounds, but from 76 till 81 or 82, we all lived outside in tents, and we had our structured group camping experience, unimpeded by others, because we were always on Bureau of Land Management land or ranch lands where we had explicitly gotten permission from the owners to camp out there with the goal of not being disturbed. So during that phase of the outside campground, we had a benefactor, and that ended up being my cousin, whose dad was very, very well off, successful in business, and he had set up trust funds for his children. So my cousin, David Van Sinderen, um, donated his trust fund to the group, and we ended up running it dry. We used it up.
Was he a
That
member?
forced,
Was he in the
yes,
class? Okay. Okay.
yeah,
Wow.
and that precipitated our decision, or T and O's decision, to move into houses where we would be closer to work, and so that started the kind of the communal aspect of the group until its demise, when about half of us would work outside the group at jobs and pretend to be normal humans, and not let on at all that we were in a kooky UFO group. And we come back and cash our checks and bring the cash back to the group and give it all to the purser, and that's what paid for our rent, food, gas, all expenses.
Wow. That must cause what my therapist would call cognitive dissonance for the person leaving every day to work in the outside world and do the like normal office thing or whatever they did and then come back. That's that has to be tricky in the mind. Were you working in the group or outside?
I worked outside for the most part. I started out working as a waiter in restaurants, and then I moved into reception work. I was a medical receptionist in Austin when we were there, and then we moved to Dallas, and I ended up working for Microsoft in their sales office.
Whoa.
Interesting side note. That was mid '80s, 1984 to '86.
Wow.
And Microsoft had just gone public shortly before I left, and I was an assistant to the regional sales manager, who was being promoted to national sales manager, and he asked me to go with him to Redmond, Washington, and of course I was in a cult, and I gave the excuse that no, I can't. My wife can't leave her job here, so I have to quit. So anyway, that was interesting. That would have changed my financial outlook drastically, probably,
Right.
because
Sure.
they were offering stock options then. Anyway,
So you were working mostly outside.
right. And then my starting work at Microsoft got me interested in computer programming. So I learned computer programming kind of on the job with that job and subsequent jobs. And that's the work that I did throughout the rest of my time in the cult, as well as my working life after the cult.
Okay. So that's pretty fortunate that you had the ability to self-teach that. That's helpful for all scenarios. But this leads me to a couple questions. So the Heaven's Gate website is sort of an iconic part of the cult's identity. I don't know if you would agree with that, but from what I read, it still exists, and it looks so much just like it maybe used to. I mean, it looks like a website that was not designed in the last couple of years, right? So were you part, right. And it was very cutting edge when Heaven's Gate, not everybody had a website when Heaven's Gate launched theirs. Were you part of that in terms of the tech and the development of that?
No, I left in August of 1993.
Okay.
The cult suicides were in March of '97, so that's 3.5 years. So I believe they developed their website probably in the last 3 years of their life. We were starting to do contracting as a company incognito. We weren't coming out and saying who we were or what we were doing, but there were enough of us who had computer skills that that we could do that, that we could eliminate the middleman and just contract directly with people who needed computer skills. So that was starting at the point that I left. So I didn't really finish my thought a few questions ago about, we were talking about intuition and about the inner guidance system and how that was suppressed. The things that started to reawaken it were coming up within the year prior to when I actually left. One of them was, and again, I left in August '93, and I think it was in April of '93, the Branch Davidian cult in Waco, Texas was splashing across front pages regarding their conflict with the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms
Yes.
branch of government. That made an impression on Doe. At that point, T had passed on, and Doe, since T's passing, had been preoccupied with the question of how will our ascension into the next level take place, because it hadn't happened over the ensuing dozen years, and he may have had some subconscious fear of his own demise, and so I don't know. That's my conjecture. So this was on his mind, and when the Branch Davidians sort of triggered their own demise through the fire that ensued from the attack by the ATB, whether they were at cause or not, I don't know, but Doe then started entertaining the thought that maybe we should get some firearms and learn to use them,
Oh,
and
wow.
in that way trigger our own demise. And that was a red flag for me, even though I never expressed it and I didn't feel that I could. I was ashamed for thinking it, because that was going against the thinking of my older member, my teacher, who I had come to see as someone who was more capable of determining my path through life. Another one was discussion of, well, first of all, we were celibate. We didn't have, there were no sexual relations. There were no relationships aside from a relationship between student and teacher. So at one point, Doe brought up to the group the idea of some of the men who were feeling like they couldn't get a hold of their sexual attraction or their sexual thoughts that were distracting them from their thoughts about the next level and from their focus on preparation for graduation. Doe suggested that the possibility of getting castrated, and brought that up to the group at large. And he didn't put us on the spot at that time. I think he put people on the spot after I left. But that was another red flag for me to take such a drastic action. And the other part of that dynamic was, at that point, for the last year prior to leaving, I had worked for a woman in Phoenix. We were in Phoenix, Arizona, who was a fairly new entrepreneur, but she was very good at her work. She was a software developer, and I was there to develop software as well. She had hired me away from a competitor who had terrible customer service skills, and so she got several of his clients continually ongoing, and she ended up hiring me. And I really enjoyed working for her. We had a lot of successes in rolling out software that clients loved, and she gave me full reign in designing the software, and I enjoyed the work, enjoyed working for her. And then I would say that during that year, working for her kept me sane. It gave me self-esteem versus coming back to the classroom experience and experiencing sameness, no uniqueness, no creativity really to speak of aloud. You were to be a cog in the wheel. And I don't know if you or your listeners have seen Star Trek, where some of the episodes they have a society called the Borg, and they are all hooked into this central computer. And several of the mantras that come up in the course of an episode with them is, you will be assimilated, and resistance is futile. And Doe thought that model was excellent. He thought that was something to be aspired to, of everyone fitting in perfectly to the machinations of the overall operation, whatever it would be. That was another red flag for me, even though I couldn't have said why it was, but it was. So anyway, I worked for this software developer, and then it came time to move. We moved periodically. I think you asked why we moved so much. And the reason was guidance that T and O received from their elders, or they felt they received. Mm-hmm. So it was time to move. We'd been there and for a year, or more, maybe it was 2 years. So we had to quit our jobs, and we would go to this new place, wherever it was, and get new ones. It was no big deal. And then on the way from Phoenix to San Diego, which is where we were going next, I started feeling this misgiving in my gut. It was like my gut was telling me I can't be here anymore. And I didn't know where it was coming from. It wasn't a mental process. It wasn't intellectual or logical. It was just, for lack of a better term, I would call it a gut knowing. And so I was traveling with a check partner. Every task we did, we had a check partner. We didn't do things by ourselves, except the work we did outside the group. So I brought it up to my check partner, and she said, well, bring it up to Doe and see what he says. So when we got to San Diego, I wrote a note to Doe, and he picked it up, read it, and came and talked to me, and he said, okay. I explained what I was feeling, and he said, okay, sleep on it. I'll talk to you in the morning.
Announcing Mind Over Murder, a new true crime podcast.
You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristen Dilley.
My name is Kristen Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas.
Join us each week as we explore new true crime cases, as well as introduce you to experts from a variety of fields in the true crime space.
You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
Available on your favorite podcast platform.
So I did. I slept on it, woke up the next morning, and then through the course of the morning, Doe and some of his helpers had set up a meeting for me to talk to him about this. And so we met in his quarters with Doe, me, and 4 other class members. It was kind of like an inquisition in that I was at one end of the table and he was at the other end of the table, and then the other 4 were on the long edges, kind of as a buffer between Doe and me. Doe started out by saying, you haven't displeased me. There's no reason for you to leave. what's going on. And I expressed again that I just had this gut knowing that I could no longer be in the group. And I think he reiterated that again, that I hadn't displeased him. There was no reason. And I just kept returning to this gut knowing as my touchstone, realizing that even if the worst scenario were to come to pass, that as they believed, the earth as a garden for souls would be plowed under and civilization would have to begin again. It didn't matter. I had to follow this gut knowing. I couldn't continue with the inner conflict, trying to override it. It was just that strong. He kind of changed his tactic a little bit and said, well, it's rotten out there, talking about human civilization, how society itself has grown rotten. And so because of that, it will be plowed under by the next level. Even that didn't make any difference to me. I just felt like I had to follow this gut knowing wherever it would take me. And I didn't know where it would take me. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what life would be like for me outside the group after having been in the group for 18 years. It was a cloistered monk-like existence, where all of our needs were taken care of over the course of the day, with the focus that we all had of preparation for the ascension we believed we were working for. So anyway, I left. We arranged for me to buy a plane ticket, and I bought a ticket back to Calgary, Alberta, Canada, where my parents lived. And they took me to the San Diego airport, and I got on a plane and flew back to Canada. And the one stark memory or etched indelible memory from that experience was flying as the plane circled around the San Diego harbor in the bright sunshine. I just felt this huge weight lift off me, and I felt elated. I felt higher than a kite, and I felt like I'd made the right choice. But to put that inner dynamic into perspective, that was what I would call now me listening to my higher self, my inner knowing. But that episode didn't trigger that listening as a way of life. It took me really years before I moved back into a position of fully resonating and fully listening to that inner knowing, fully trusting it, because it is a trust issue. It's because we're taught not to trust, and the cult made that even more pronounced, of not trusting our own thinking. It was, to me, that model was wrong. It was off. We need to learn to trust our inner knowing, which itself is a learning process because of the influence of all kinds of external factors that come into play in our decision making.
Wow. Frank, that's a lot. I have to ask and assume that you hadn't been in touch with your parents. So what do mom and dad say when you show up after all these years? What do they know? What do they not know? And I just can't imagine that reunion.
Right. Well, they didn't know a lot, although right around the time that T passed on, the woman who had been Doe's partner and was Doe's older member, we had been receiving information somehow that family members were looking for their loved ones. The parents were looking for their children. Children were looking for their parents, whoever had joined, and not told. We never told our families much about what we were doing. Occasionally we would send a postcard or a brief letter saying, we're fine, don't worry about us, we're doing what we want to do, but we were always very vague. We somehow learned that some of the parents had connected with each other, some of the family members, and had created their own network. So they were gathering information and trading it and developing this understanding about what we were doing. Wow. Also, there were ex-members who assisted with that. So that T&O considered that a threat to our being able to continue unimpeded in our studies in our classroom. And so with that in mind, they instigated visits back to our parents for 3 or 4 days, or back to our families.
Okay.
And this was in the mid 80s. It was like 84, 85, 86. So they did have some contact with us at that point. And then after that, we continued sending them the occasional letter to set their minds at ease, even though, it probably didn't do that to any degree. So when I called my parents the day that I was leaving, they were surprised and they were overjoyed, and they welcomed me with open arms.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. I love the idea of a group of parents, pre-internet, finding ways of finding each other and connecting and putting these pieces together, because their kids, they know that something wasn't right, and they knew their kids were not well and were not safe. There's something really amazing about that, knowing that. I've never heard that. Do you, looking back, because you know what we all know now, and the horrible tragedy that occurred just a few years later, I mean, that gut knowing you had saved your life, ultimately. Mm-hmm. So do you think that's why it was so strong and so persistent and louder than everything else that might have maybe made you change your mind, that it just propelled you to get out of there?
Well, yeah, it definitely was stronger than any of the conditioning of the prior years. But here's where I want to talk about kind of two perspectives at once. Okay. What did you term it? What was the term before? Cognitive dissonance? Yes, it was a tragedy, and yet it's my belief through what I've learned since then and the wisdom that I've gained since then is at least every major aspect of each of our lives is planned in advance. I believe in reincarnation. I don't know what you or your listeners, how they feel about that.
Okay.
But that is an important part of my own belief system now. There's what's called the pre-birth planning session before a soul incarnates into a lifetime. They decide what they want to learn during that lifetime amongst their soul group of the people around them who are assisting them in that process. People will volunteer and say, well, I will assist you with that. I will play XYZ part in that. I will play somebody who you have to forgive. If you want to learn forgiveness, you'll need somebody to forgive. So I will play that part. I will forget who I am because I love you so much. And I will play that part in your life. And you will have to remember who you are and who I am for both of us because of the part that I've decided to play. So there's a dark and light interplay for the purpose of wisdom, for the purpose of learning, for the purpose of expanding we don't know what is at the end of the life. We don't, nobody has come back to tell us, or at least that's the mainstream view, even though religions have answered that for us in various ways. But I was heartbroken by the suicide, and yet nothing happens without a reason. So no matter what, no matter whether you lost your daughter or your son through that event, it's there to teach us something that we wanted to learn before we incarnated, that we forgot about when we incarnate, because the veil descends, the veil of forgetfulness descends, and we don't remember anything about pre-birth planning or anything about who we are at the soul level. And so that's tough medicine, I'm sure, for a lot of people to hear me say that. But I believe it's true. And so, your podcast, I don't remember the full name, Dialogue, Yellow Tape, and so Yellow Tape to me invokes the police line, do not cross view, and so a crime has been committed here. And so was a crime committed in T and Doe taking the authority over us and presenting themselves as authorities who had more knowledge and more wisdom than we ourselves did in directing our own lives? I would have to say that, just based on my own experience, the main thing that I learned that came out of this was something that I wasn't aware of when I went in, was the importance of listening to my inner guidance system, whether you call that the indwelling of God or higher self, or oversoul, the higher part of ourselves that is all-knowing, whether, no matter what your religious belief is. There's commonality throughout the world with different approaches to that. Without my Heaven's Gate experience, I don't think I would have learned that. And to me, it's so valuable. And to me, it will serve me going forward in ways that I don't know about yet.
I think I can get my head around most of that. Maybe not all. So you have to forgive me. I'm working this out in real time, and I believe you, and I respect all the way you're looking at it. You kind of put forth the question, so was a crime committed through the leader's manipulation of the group? And, from where I sit, which is certainly a lot longer distance than from where you sat, but yeah, there really was. And so it's hard for me to reconcile that with everything happening for a reason, which I do happen to believe. I think about it more as though there's a purpose behind everything more than a reason per se. And the purpose might be the growth or the healing or the learning, but I don't like to think it was a reason. I don't like to think that somebody's manipulation and wrongdoing. Well, see, this is really tricky. It's really hard. And that's a tough one, because I'm sure a lot of the parents and family members and loved ones of all 39 of those people surely felt something really wrong and very criminal happened, and that it might have been suicide per se, but that they weren't making their own decisions at that point, and there was so much coercive control involved. So how do you reconcile that? And I think this goes into something I wrote to you about, which I read that or something you shared with me offline about perpetrator and victim. I mean, this is where I think this is rubbing right up against your thoughts that you said something about there not being a perpetrator and victim. Maybe you could just expand on that, because I think I see it differently. I see sometimes victims of cults becoming perpetrators. They become leaders and then they recruit more people, and I don't know what happens in that case criminally and legally, but I certainly think there are perpetrators. So talk to me about how you view these roles within a dynamic like a cult.
Right. Well, the perpetrator-victim dynamic. Well, I don't think you can have a perpetrator without a victim, and you can't have a victim without a perpetrator. Well, I don't consider myself a victim, even though some people might see me and my classmates as victims of my own naivety or of the manipulation of the two leaders. They believed their talk. I don't know if they wavered in that belief, but they walked their talk thoroughly, which isn't to say it was right. I believe they had a lot of things right, and they had a few key things really, really wrong. One of which was we are all capable of being our own guides through life. We have this God-given facility within us called intuition, called gut knowing, called our connection with God, or however we want to term it.
Okay, so I'd like to know your recovery process, this journey to, where you're thinking now, your spirituality, your self-acceptance, self-love, and I would imagine there's some forgiveness involved. I don't know. I don't want to put that on you. Okay. So you leave, you go to your parents' house, and you had that strong gut knowing, but you said that was almost like a one-time thing. You had to then retrain to be able to tap into that and to utilize that again in the future. So can you just share a bit about how you started the recovery process?
Yeah, it was like I was casting about in the dark because I didn't have a clue what to do in my life. All I knew was how to make a living, how to work. I was inept socially. It was I didn't know how to make friends, really. I was always introverted, I should say, but this was dysfunctional. I was dysfunctional socially. I was a workaholic because that's what I knew how to do, and yet I didn't have any friends. I dove into a relationship within the first few weeks of being back in Calgary, but again, I had no boundaries. That's the thing about having given up personal boundaries in the cult because of giving away my power and my determination of how to live my life. I didn't have that societal conditioning, for better or worse, of knowing where I stopped and someone else began. So that was a struggle. And also, I'm sure you can hear in my voice, I have a little bit of a stutter. And that was more extreme back then. I had developed a stutter in probably the mid to late 80s through my own suppression of my authentic expression that wasn't allowed. There was this push-pull within me, and I can't speak for others whether or not this is true, but for me, there was always this reservation in the back of my mind, resisting completely giving away my power, which is maybe why I could listen to that gut knowing that got me out. But whenever that resistance came up, I was ashamed of it because it seemed to me to be contrary to what Teen Do were teaching. So I began a search because I wanted assistance with the stutter, and I also wanted to find my way back to equilibrium in society at large. I didn't know how to function, so I fairly soon moved into personal development seminars here and there, and which wasn't as common back then, 1993, as it is now. But I did all kinds of searching. I ended up going to see counselors. I actually drank quite a bit for a while, alcohol, and of course that didn't work. And, you know, I tried marijuana and I didn't get along too well with that either. So, but I was searching for answers because, again, my view of society was there must be something else. There's something beyond this. So I was always looking for the story behind the story, which T and Do were more than happy to answer, and they did in many ways. You know, they opened my eyes to the possibilities of completely different levels of society and levels of beingness. That this is the reason that I joined, that I didn't feel like I had access to anywhere else. And later on, I felt like that was not true. That was a misunderstanding. There is access to tons and tons of knowledge, even though it may be hidden from mainstream view. There's lots of knowledge that is, I think, now more than ever coming to light. To me, the logical mind is overrated. It has its place, but intuition is more based in the heart and in the gut. We can gain knowledge, we can absorb knowledge intuitively that we may not have access to through our logical mind, through our deductive powers.
This is all so helpful and interesting. And I'm thinking as you're talking, in this age of information and the internet and the more we know every single day, do you think it's getting harder for us to operate from the intuitive place? Is that harder for us to trust and to even identify because we have so much capability of knowledge?
I would say yes and no. Yes, because we are bombarded with magnitudes more information than we've ever been confronted with on a minute by minute basis. So many shiny things vying for our attention. And yet, from an energetic, metaphysical point of view, I feel like our world is also being showered with energetic information that is assisting us to awaken to what is beyond our 5 sense view of reality.
What does that look like? How does that show up to you?
For me, it shows up in, like, I'm a life coach now. And so in my life coaching, intuition is a huge part of that. And it's my goal with every person that I sit down with to be a conduit of whatever their higher self wants me to lead them to. And whether you believe in higher self or God or spirit guides or angels or anything of that nature that is other dimensional, those beings, those sources of information, that highest essence who only has our best outcome at heart, that's where I want to reach in my coaching session. That's what I want to be a conduit for through my questions for my client, leading them back to whatever may be blocking them from their full potential.
That resonates, and your work with your clients, you're trying to point them to that place within them as well, not prescribing them a path.
No, absolutely not. The way I want to coach is the way I've been coached, which is, what questions can I ask my client so that they arrive at the answer that's best for them?
Yeah. It sounds like your practices in your life have helped you reclaim so much that maybe you were missing or lost during your time in Heaven's Gate, right? It's almost, I see in you, the way you're speaking, that there's like a double awareness, your conscious self, and then you're also operating on this higher spiritual plane. It feels, I see two ways you're consciously, it's hard to describe. I guess I feel you're more tapped into that than most people, I would say, I know. And so it feels, in a good way, like a real shift, not an overcompensation, but a movement towards a very opposite end of where you were when you were in the cult.
Yeah, definitely. It's a wider perspective, and it's following my inner guidance more than I ever did in the cult. It's internal guidance versus external metrics by which we would judge everything that we did, whether including how we felt, how we talked, how we thought. Yes, so diametrically opposed in that way. And then also, yes, my journey since leaving the cult has brought me through my experiences of first of all, of having given away my power in so many ways to the two leaders, as well as through my struggle in returning back to myself after having left the group. The whole experience has brought me in touch with deep, deep compassion for the people around me.
Fascinating. I mean, do you have a book in you, do you think? A story that needs to be written?
Yes, I am. I started a book about my experience in Heaven's Gate cult and my time afterwards. And I started that in 2015. And toward the beginning of this year, I made the goal that I want to get the book out the door because I'd call it maybe half written, but the story keeps getting longer. But I do have a publisher in mind, and she agrees I need to get the book out the door, and I really like her game plan. I like her structure that she has for the publication. Her royalties are higher than the normal publishers, and she does a lot more marketing, which most publishers don't do any. So anyway, that's why I'm currently pet sitting here in Las Vegas, and my goal is to get a big chunk of the book written during this time. Yeah, so that's on the docket.
Good. I'm glad. I think there's obviously a book in you, and I would love to read it. And please let me know when it's finished. I know there's so much more we haven't even, we didn't even get to, and I know you have so much more to tell. But I have to ask you something that I ask all my guests before they go, and that is, what is keeping you up at night?
Well, I sleep pretty well. I don't really have any chronic issues keeping me up at night.
Good. Can be figurative.
Well, I guess the biggest thing is what's next for me. I mean, these are strange times. Right now, today, this year has been unusual in so many ways, and yet I look again the story behind the story. So I'm always interested in, well, what's going on to trigger this? What's motivating people to do the things they do? And so I, as well as many people that I speak with, have an understanding of this time as a tipping point in Earth's history that is unmatched for millennia. Something like this hasn't happened in the Earth story for millennia. And to me, the outcome will be either very good or very bad. And it depends on the individual point of view, whether that's the case, whether it's good or bad. And it will be both. It'll be good for many, and it will be not so good for some. And so, in that way, I think there's a divergence of timelines of separate realities depending on how people see themselves and the people around them, which is a reflection of themselves. So, so I wonder about what my role is in this unfolding saga of Earth, and probably more than wondering what it is, I allow myself to be derailed from what I envisioned it to be, out of the fear of stepping out into that. So I guess if anything keeps me awake at night, it's the over-analysis, the analysis paralysis, and the second guessing of that role that I have envisioned. I wrote a short story about it, even in 2015. Anyway, that's the long answer, I guess.
That's a relatable answer. I'm feeling that too. And I just really appreciate you and sharing your story and so much about what you've overcome and transcended and continue to transcend into. And it's really amazing. And I want to thank you for being on Dialogue.
Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. I appreciate your questions and your openness to listen to my answers and perhaps my alternative view to the way you view the world. And it's been my pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thanks for killing the small talk. Dialogue is a Yellow Tape Media production edited by Jason Usry and produced and hosted by me, Rebecca Sebastian. Please be sure to subscribe to Dialogue, a true crime conversation, wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across all platforms. You can also drop me a note or a guest suggestion or sign up for my newsletter at RebeccaSebastian.com. Be sure to join me every Wednesday for a new episode and another killer conversation.